Have you ever noticed how life feels heavier the more you try to control it? You chase achievements, seek approval, and guard your image as if your existence depends on it, yet the satisfaction never comes. Most men look at this struggle and conclude that life is unfair, that the world is hostile, or that they are simply not strong enough. They treat fear and weakness as enemies to be conquered, believing that by ignoring them, they will disappear. But what if this assumption is exactly what keeps you trapped? What if the real problem is not life itself, but the way your mind has been hijacked by something invisible, something quietly shaping your every move? Before we go further, consider subscribing and sharing this reflection. Each comment and like helps this message reach another man who may be quietly suffocating under the same invisible weight. The truth Alan Watts teaches us is startling in its simplicity. Fear, weakness, and anxiety are not signs of failure. They are symptoms of the ego's relentless hold over you. The ego convinces you that your value depends on appearances, that your worth is measured by what you possess, what you control, and how others perceive you. It whispers that you are separate, fragile, and in constant danger. And so you tighten your grip on life, only to feel it slipping further away. What seems like weakness, the trembling before a challenge, the unease in solitude, is actually a signal that the ego is being fed. It thrives on your resistance and magnifies the illusion of danger. Yet within this very struggle lies the doorway to freedom. What you have long regarded as fear is in fact the mind pointing out the walls you have built around yourself. What you mistake for weakness is actually a mirror reflecting the ego's illusions, demanding that you see them. Alan Watts reminds us that the moment you stop resisting, stop pretending, and stop living according to the ego's script, a profound clarity emerges. Suddenly, fear becomes a teacher rather than a tyrant, and weakness transforms into a quiet strength that does not need validation. It is here, in this subtle shift of perception, that the first true step toward liberation begins. By the end of this reflection, you will see how what feels like a constant fight for survival is actually an invitation to awaken. You will begin to understand that strength is not forged by domination or aggression, but by awareness, by learning to see the ego's trap and step aside. Life does not demand that you eliminate fear or weakness, but that you understand them, embrace them, and let them guide you into a freedom that has always been within reach. Stay with me and allow this journey to reveal the hidden power that emerges when you are no longer enslaved by the ego. Before awakening to the truth, most men live as though the ego is their master and their own instincts are a threat. Every choice, every word, every glance is filtered through the lens of how it will appear to others. You seek validation in accomplishments, in status, in fleeting pleasures, believing that these external markers will shield you from fear. Yet the more you chase, the more anxious you become, as if running on a treadmill that only accelerates. Life feels heavy, every moment measured against an invisible standard, every failure amplified by the ego's insatiable voice. You tell yourself you must be stronger, more capable, more in control, while secretly trembling beneath the surface, convinced that if anyone truly saw you, you would collapse. Then a subtle awakening begins. Perhaps it is a moment of silence, a pause in the relentless rhythm of achievement, or a quiet reflection in solitude. In that pause, the illusions of the ego start to unravel. You begin to see that fear and weakness are not enemies, but signals, indicators that the ego has been steering your life like a hidden puppeteer. What once felt like vulnerability now becomes a doorway to understanding. You notice the absurdity of measuring your worth by others' approval, and a strange sense of relief washes over you. The treadmill slows, and you realize that the chase was never necessary. The freedom you longed for was hidden behind the very fear you had been resisting. External reactions follow almost immediately. Friends, colleagues, and even strangers perceive a change in you. Some may whisper that you have become distant, detached, or arrogant because you no longer conform to their expectations. Yet inside, you are no longer burdened by the need to perform, to please, to be recognized. There is a calm authority that comes not from conquest, but from clarity. Your inner world is no longer a battlefield. Fear and weakness are no longer chains, but teachers guiding you toward understanding the deeper currents of life. The contrast is striking. The world sees distance, but you know balance. They see strangeness, but you have discovered coherence. In this new perspective, the meaning of strength itself transforms. Strength is no longer measured by how much you can dominate, control, or suppress, but by how fully you embrace reality without resistance. The ego may still whisper, still attempt to drag you into old habits of judgment and comparison, yet each time you notice its grip loosening, you reclaim a little more of yourself. You understand that the very qualities you once feared, uncertainty, fragility, silence, are in fact the scaffolding of your liberation. By allowing them, by acknowledging them, you step beyond the trap the ego had constructed and begin to live with a quiet, undeniable power. As the ego loosens its hold, fear and weakness begin to reveal their true faces. What once felt like a threat, a trembling in the heart before a difficult decision, a hesitation in solitude, now appears as a guide. These sensations are not signs of inadequacy, but signals pointing toward authenticity. The man who learns to observe them without judgment discovers that life does not demand perfection, only awareness. Each moment of discomfort becomes a mirror reflecting the illusions he has carried, and in looking closely, he finds that the foundation of his anxieties was never reality itself, but the stories the ego told him about what life should be. This new awareness transforms everyday experiences. Where before he might have sought approval in every conversation, now he listens fully, responding not to impress, but to understand. Where he once measured his worth by the outcomes of ventures and the praise of peers, he now measures it by the clarity and calmness with which he navigates life's inevitable challenges. The world may still react with confusion or judgment, interpreting his detachment as arrogance or strangeness, but these perceptions no longer define him. He has discovered that true freedom does not reside in the absence of external opinion, but in the sovereignty of one's inner life. The transformation continues in layers. Relationships shift not because he withdraws from the world, but because he no longer participates in its illusions. The men and women who once thrived on drama, approval, and manipulation feel unsettled by his presence. Yet in that distance lies a profound honesty. He is no longer performing for anyone, and in doing so, he models a form of strength they cannot fabricate. His life becomes a quiet testament to the power of presence and awareness, demonstrating that clarity, not dominance, is the true measure of mastery. The ego's trap is no longer invisible. It is understood, observed, and outgrown. In this stage, even desire begins to change. The restless longing for more validation, more control, more recognition, softens. He experiences the world directly, savoring the subtleties of being without needing to possess or conquer them. Strength emerges as a natural consequence of clarity, not effort. Fear becomes the signal that guides him, rather than the force that binds him. What seemed like weakness now anchors him, providing a steady awareness from which all decisions flow. The man who once feared the vulnerability of his own mind now stands in it fully, embracing both the fragility and the resilience that coexist within him. As this inner transformation deepens, the man's outward life begins to reflect a quiet tension between perception and reality. To those around him, he may appear distant, even cold, because he no longer bends to the expectations and pressures imposed by society or the ego. People notice that he is less reactive, less eager to argue, less concerned with the fleeting judgments that once dominated his every interaction. They interpret this calm detachment as arrogance or indifference, yet the truth is quite different. Inside, he is more present than ever, attuned to the subtleties of life, and grounded in a clarity that his former self could never have imagined. The apparent isolation is not emptiness, it is a deliberate space for thought, reflection, and authenticity. This tension between how he appears and who he has become is a powerful teacher. By no longer performing for approval, he exposes the illusions that govern most human interactions. The ego craves recognition, yet he refuses to feed it, choosing instead the company of awareness and sincerity. He begins to see the patterns in others' behaviors, the ways people cling to validation, control, and fear. Where he once participated in these cycles, he now observes them from a distance, untangled and free. This creates a subtle but profound influence. People are drawn to his presence, not because he seeks their attention, but because he radiates a rare kind of honesty, a sense of life lived without pretense. The reinterpretation of fear and weakness continues. What society labels as vulnerability or fragility now becomes a source of power. The man understands that acknowledging his fear does not diminish him. It deepens his capacity for perception and action. Weakness, in the eyes of the ego, is a liability, but he recognizes it as a key to understanding the human condition. By embracing what he once denied, he transcends the limitations the ego imposed, transforming hesitation into patience, uncertainty into insight, and solitude into strength. Life no longer demands that he resist these qualities. It asks only that he see them clearly, and in doing so, he discovers the freedom to act from a place of true alignment. This shift does not go unnoticed by the world. Friends, colleagues, and even strangers feel a subtle friction, sensing that he is no longer fully part of the same illusion. They may try to draw him back into familiar patterns, expecting the reactive, eager-to-please man they once knew, but each attempt is met with an unspoken calm, a presence that neither asserts nor defends, simply exists. The tension between appearance and essence becomes a mirror not only for him, but for others. It quietly challenges them to question the roles they play, the fears they carry, and the ways in which the ego has trapped them. In his silence, his clarity speaks volumes, and the life he once thought he was losing is now expanding in ways he never imagined. As this newfound clarity solidifies, the consequences of living beyond the ego's grip become more tangible. The man begins to notice subtle shifts in his environment. Conversations take on a different tone. Challenges are no longer storms to weather, but invitations to exercise awareness, and his own reactions are calmer, more deliberate. Whereas before, he would have been consumed by judgment, resentment, or ambition, he now approaches life with a quiet curiosity, a willingness to witness without interference. The ego still whispers, reminding him of past insecurities and imagined failures. Yet each time he acknowledges the voice without surrendering to it, his inner space expands, and the energy once wasted on fear transforms into strength and presence. This transformation ripples outward. Relationships that were once fraught with tension ease, not because he conforms, but because his authenticity demands a new equilibrium. The people who remain close to him are drawn not by appearances, but by depth, sincerity, and the calm confidence that radiates from one who no longer hides behind masks. Meanwhile, those who cannot match this honesty drift away, and in their absence, he experiences a sense of liberation rather than loss. The life that once felt heavy and constrained now has room to breathe, to unfold organically, free from the invisible strings that the ego had attached to every choice and every interaction. Within this space, the man also begins to reinterpret power itself. No longer is power a measure of dominance, wealth, or influence over others. True power is subtle, almost imperceptible. It is the ability to remain unshaken, to act without compulsion, to navigate the world with awareness rather than reaction. He discovers that strength does not require confrontation or aggression. It emerges naturally from clarity and presence. Fear, once a constant enemy, becomes a teacher, pointing to areas where the ego still lingers, and weakness becomes a resource, revealing where growth and understanding are possible. In this way, life itself becomes a mirror, reflecting back the lessons that the ego had hidden behind anxiety and striving. Even daily life, the ordinary and seemingly mundane, carries new meaning. Tasks that once felt burdensome are now approached with focus and attention, not as obligations, but as opportunities to exercise discernment and patience. Small victories, once overlooked, are savored as proof that the inner landscape has shifted. The man who was once ruled by fear and the need for approval now experiences the subtle rhythms of life directly, unmediated by the ego's distortions. Each day becomes a practice, a living laboratory in which clarity, freedom, and strength are cultivated quietly, without fanfare, yet with profound effect. The transformation is both internal and external, a continuous unfolding toward a life that no longer fears, but fully engages with the depth and unpredictability of existence. At this stage, the man's life begins to reflect a subtle but unmistakable coherence. The contrast between his inner world and the external pressures of society becomes less jarring, because he has learned to move with the currents rather than against them. Decisions are no longer reactions to fear, approval, or ego-driven desire. They emerge naturally from a deep sense of presence and understanding. Where before life felt like a constant negotiation with an invisible enemy, now each moment is experienced with quiet authority, a recognition that he is not at the mercy of circumstance, but in dialogue with it. The freedom that seemed distant now permeates every thought, every action, every breath. This transformation extends beyond the personal into the relational. People notice, often unconsciously, that he no longer engages in the petty dramas that once dominated interactions. He speaks less to impress and more to convey truth. He acts without attachment to outcomes, and this lack of compulsion paradoxically draws others closer. The tension between how he appears and who he has become continues, yet it no longer isolates him. It serves as a bridge, a living example of what is possible when fear and weakness are met with awareness rather than resistance. Those who once sought to dominate or manipulate him find that their influence has waned, and in that shift he experiences a liberation that is both protective and empowering. Even the ego itself, once a source of relentless turmoil, is now seen with clear eyes. Its attempts to assert control, to instill fear, or to provoke attachment are observed and understood. He no longer responds with resistance or denial, but with recognition and discernment. In this way, fear becomes a tool, weakness a teacher, and the illusions of the ego a map toward deeper self-knowledge. Every challenge, every moment of doubt, every encounter with the unpredictable world becomes an opportunity to exercise this newfound clarity. The very qualities that once imprisoned him now cultivate his strength, turning what seemed like liability into the foundation of wisdom and presence. Ultimately, the man learns that transformation is not about eliminating the ego or silencing fear, but about seeing clearly how they operate and stepping aside from their demands. Life, once a battleground of anxieties and imagined threats, becomes a canvas for deliberate action, reflection, and quiet power. He understands that the freedom he sought externally was always an inner matter, and that the costs of truth, distance from illusions, discomfort in solitude, resistance from others, are in fact the indicators of growth, not failure. In embracing fear, weakness, and uncertainty, he discovers a profound strength that is invisible to the unobservant, yet undeniable in its effects, radiating into every aspect of his existence. In the end, what once seemed like isolation reveals itself as clarity. The man who appeared distant, strange, or aloof to others is not lost, but profoundly present. What seemed like weakness, the trembling, the uncertainty, the hesitations, has become a source of quiet strength, a foundation upon which a life of authenticity is built. The fear that once bound him now guides him with subtle precision, pointing out the illusions that the ego once relied upon to control him. What looked like loss, the fading of certain relationships, the distancing from old patterns, the absence of validation, emerges as liberation, the space in which he can fully inhabit his own being without compromise or pretense. He has discovered a paradox that the world rarely understands. To surrender to the truth of one's experience is not to become weak, but to awaken. To face fear without resistance is not to lose, but to gain a freedom that cannot be measured by accolades, possessions, or approval. In stepping out of the ego's trap, he has stepped into a life that is intimate, grounded, and unshakable. The judgments of others no longer define him, nor does the restless compulsion to perform. He moves through the world with a quiet authority, an unspoken wisdom that speaks through presence rather than words, through action rather than posturing. This transformation is not dramatic in the conventional sense. It is not signaled by applause or recognition, but by the subtle resonance of clarity, the steady pulse of inner freedom. Every choice, every action, every thought now carries the weight of awareness, and in this weightlessness he discovers the fullness of life. The ego's whispers are still present, but they are no longer commanding. They are observed, understood, and transcended. What once felt like fear and weakness now illuminates the path forward, revealing that the power he sought externally was always within, quietly waiting for him to notice. If this reflection resonates with you, consider sharing it with someone who may need to hear it. Each comment, each conversation extends the understanding that freedom and clarity are possible, that fear and weakness are not enemies, but guides. Subscribe for more reflections like this, and take a moment to write your thoughts or experiences below. By participating, you not only honor your own journey, but contribute to a conversation that gives life to others walking similar paths. The ego's trap can be recognized, stepped aside from, and ultimately transcended. And in that transcending, life reveals its true depth, its quiet strength, and its enduring freedom.